The argument began before sunrise. Eleanor Voss had learned, over the course of 20 years living in the Voss household, to identify the nature of a dispute by its sound alone. There were the low, controlled arguments, the ones her parents conducted behind closed doors with careful voices, the kind that left no marks but lasted for days. There were the sharp, sudden ones, quick as a slap, over before breakfast. And then there were the ones like this morning's, a rolling, escalating negotiation conducted at full volume in the dining room, as though the house itself were a stage and the servants an audience. She heard her father's voice first. Thomas Voss, a man of middling fortune and tremendous self-regard, spoke in the particular tone he reserved for business dealings he found distasteful but necessary, clipped, efficient. The tone of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply managing the details. Her brother's voice followed. Robert, 24 and already shaped in their father's image, laughed at something. It was not a kind laugh. Eleanor sat up in bed and listened. She could not make out the words, only the rhythm of the exchange, the way her father's sentences ended in finality while Robert's ended in agreement. A conversation between two people who had already reached the same conclusion and were now simply enjoying the architecture of it. She dressed without calling for her maid, a habit she had cultivated over years. The less help she accepted in the morning, the less she owed anyone before noon. She chose a plain gray dress, pinned her hair without looking too carefully at the mirror, and descended the stairs with the quiet, deliberate steps of someone who had learned that silence was a form of intelligence. The dining room door was open. Her father stood at the head of the table, a document spread before him, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. Robert leaned against the window frame, still in his evening clothes from the night before, arms crossed and expression satisfied. Between them, on the polished mahogany surface, lay a single sheet of paper. Eleanor stopped in the doorway. Neither man looked up immediately. Her father was signing something, pressing the pen with the particular flourish he used when he wished to appear important. Robert was watching him with the expression of someone waiting for applause. It was her mother who noticed her first. Catherine Voss materialized from the corner of the room the way she always did, silently, precisely, already composed. She was a handsome woman who had once been beautiful, and she wore the memory of that beauty like a second dress. She looked at Eleanor standing in the doorway, took in the expression on her daughter's face, and said simply, "Close your mouth, Eleanor. It's for a good cause." Eleanor had not realized her mouth was open. She stepped into the room. Her eyes moved to the document on the table, to the neat columns of text, the official letterhead, the line at the bottom where her father's signature was still drying. And there, at the top of the page, in careful printed letters, Boston Charitable Society, Annual Spring Auction Item Entry Form, a lady's hand, submitted by Thomas H. Voss, on behalf of Miss Eleanor A. Voss. The room was very quiet. "What is this?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She had always been grateful for that, the way her voice refused to betray her even when everything else wanted to collapse. Her father finally looked up. He had the expression he wore when explaining financial matters to people he considered slow, patient, slightly condescending, fundamentally disinterested in the response. "It is exactly what it appears to be," he said. "The Boston Charitable Society holds its spring gala in 3 days. This year the featured auction is a social engagement, a lady's hand for an evening dance and supper. The proceeds go to the Children's Hospital Fund." "My hand," Eleanor said. "Your hand," he confirmed, and picked up his coffee. Robert pushed off the window frame and smiled. "You should be flattered. They needed someone young enough to be worth bidding on. Margaret Hollis was the first choice, but her father has more sense than to—" He stopped, seemingly aware he had said something impolitic, and redirected. "The point is, it's a charity event. An honor, really." "An honor," Eleanor repeated. "The bidding will be modest," her father said. "A formality. You'll dance with whoever wins, have supper, come home. The family's name appears in the program as a donor. Everyone benefits." Eleanor looked at her mother. Catherine Voss met her daughter's gaze with the serene implacability of a woman who had long ago decided that the most comfortable position in any situation was the one that required the least resistance. She smoothed the front of her dress with one gloved hand and said, "You'll wear the blue Empire gown, the one with the lace shawl. You look well in it." That was the entirety of her mother's contribution to the conversation. Eleanor stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. She looked at the document, at her name printed in someone else's handwriting, submitted by someone else's hand, arranged by people who shared her blood, and had apparently decided that her dignity was a reasonable line item in a charitable transaction. She thought about arguing. She catalogued the arguments available to her. The reasonable ones, the emotional ones, the ones that appealed to pride or decency or simple logic. She had learned over 20 years that none of them worked. Not with Thomas Voss, not in a house where the currency of affection had always been compliance. So she said nothing. She turned, walked back through the doorway, and returned upstairs. The 3 days between that morning and the night of the gala passed in a specific kind of silence, the kind that exists not in the absence of sound, but in the deliberate avoidance of certain subjects. Meals were taken, pleasantries were exchanged. Her mother twice mentioned the blue dress in tones that suggested the matter was entirely settled, and Eleanor twice did not respond. On the afternoon of the third day, her maid Agnes came to help her dress. Agnes was a small, careful woman of 35 who had worked in the Voss household since Eleanor was 12. She said very little as she helped Eleanor into the gown, fastening the hooks at the back, adjusting the lace shawl, smoothing the pale blue silk with practiced hands. But at one point, when the work was done and Eleanor was standing before the mirror, Agnes paused. "Miss Eleanor," she said quietly, "are you all right?" Eleanor looked at her own reflection. The dress was, as her mother had predicted, flattering. The pale blue Empire cut suited her coloring, the lace at her shoulders soft and feminine. She looked, she thought, exactly like someone who was supposed to be there, someone who had chosen this. Someone who was not, in 3 hours' time, going to stand on a platform in a ballroom full of Boston's finest families while they laughed and pointed and placed bets. "I'm fine, Agnes," she said. Agnes said nothing more, but her hands, when she tucked a final pin into Eleanor's hair, were unusually gentle. The Hargrove ballroom was everything that money and old family and a complete absence of restraint could produce. 3 chandeliers cast warm gold light across a crowd of 200 guests, the men in dark coats and white cravats, the women in silks of cream and rose and deep burgundy. The air smelled of beeswax candles, expensive perfume, and the particular self-satisfaction of people who had never once doubted their right to be in a room. Eleanor arrived with her parents and Robert, was separated from them almost immediately by the press of guests, and found herself standing near the eastern wall with a glass of punch she had no intention of drinking, and a smile she had assembled specifically for evenings like this, pleasant enough to avoid comment, blank enough to discourage conversation. She had perhaps 40 minutes before the auction began. She spent them observing. This was another habit cultivated over years of social events she had not chosen to attend. The careful, systematic study of a room, who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, where the real conversations happened, not in the center of the floor but at the margins, near windows and doorways, in the spaces between the spectacle. It was during one of these observations that she first saw him. He stood near the far end of the room, apart from the nearest cluster of guests by several deliberate feet. Tall, taller than most men in the room, with dark hair and a stillness about him that was immediately distinct from the animated social performance happening everywhere around him. He held a glass but did not drink from it. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply present in the particular way that very powerful people sometimes allowed themselves to be present, without effort, without performance, without any apparent concern for whether anyone noticed. She knew who he was. Everyone in Boston knew who he was, Duke James Hargrove. The event was being held in his family's home. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a fortune so considerable that people stopped trying to estimate it and simply said considerable and moved on. He had been in Europe for the better part of 3 years and had returned to Boston 6 weeks ago to a flurry of social speculation that Eleanor had observed with complete detachment, having no personal stake in who the Duke of Hargrove might or might not choose to marry. She watched him for a moment. He did not look in her direction. Then the auctioneer's bell rang, and Eleanor set down her untouched punch, straightened her lace shawl, and walked toward the platform at the center of the room. The laughter started before she had fully climbed the steps. Not all of it cruel. Some of it was simply the bright, social laughter of people who found the entire event amusing and did not think particularly hard about what they were laughing at. But some of it was specific. She heard her brother's voice somewhere in the crowd, a comment she could not make out but whose tone she recognized. She heard a woman's sharp giggle, followed by a whispered exchange. She saw a man near the front nudge his companion and nod toward the platform with raised eyebrows. Eleanor stood very still. She clasped her hands in front of her. She looked at a point slightly above the heads of the crowd, a technique she had developed for enduring her father's lectures, which translated, she found, quite well to other situations requiring dignified endurance. She kept her expression neutral. She kept her breathing even. The auctioneer began his introduction. The words washed over her without landing. Charitable donation. Lady's hand. An evening of refined companionship. Bidding to begin at... And then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a figure moved. No raised hand. No called number. Just a man walking forward through a parted crowd, dropping a heavy bag of coins on the table beside the auctioneer without breaking stride, and saying 2 words in a voice so quiet and so absolute that the laughter nearest to Eleanor stopped as though it had been cut with a knife. She's done. The Duke of Hargrove did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not explain himself or smile or perform any of the social gestures that the moment seemed to demand. He looked only at Eleanor. And for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone looked at her not as a joke, not as a transaction, not as a problem to be managed or a daughter to be leveraged. He looked at her as though she were a person. Eleanor Voss, standing on a platform in her mother's chosen dress in her family's borrowed humiliation, felt something shift in her chest, small and precise and entirely unexpected. She did not yet know what it meant, but she did not look away. He did not offer his arm. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed as the Duke of Hargrove turned from the auctioneer's table and moved toward the side corridor. The way he did not extend his elbow in the practiced, social gesture that any other man in that room would have produced automatically, as reflex, as performance. He simply walked, and the subtle angle of his movement made it clear that she was expected to follow. She followed. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, not the way it parted in stories, with gasps and whispers cascading like dominoes. It parted the way crowds parted for James Hargrove in every room he entered. Quietly, efficiently, with the particular deference reserved for men whose power was so established it required no demonstration. A few heads turned. A few conversations paused. Eleanor caught a glimpse of her mother's face near the punch table. The expression there was not concern. It was calculation. Then the corridor door closed behind them, and the ballroom noise reduced itself to a muffled hum, and Eleanor found herself in a long, candle-lit hallway lined with oil portraits and dark wood paneling, alone with a man she had observed from across a room 40 minutes ago and had not, until this moment, spoken a single word to. She stopped walking. He continued for 3 more steps before he seemed to register her stillness. Then he turned. In the corridor light, away from the crowd and the chandeliers and the social spectacle, he looked different than he had across the ballroom. Less like a figure observed from a distance and more like a specific person. The line of tension in his jaw, the careful way his eyes moved over her face as though cataloging something. He was not, she realized, entirely composed. There was something underneath the stillness. She could not yet name it. "You'll want to sit," he said. "I'm perfectly capable of standing," Eleanor replied. A pause. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, not quite surprise, but its quieter cousin. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you are." He did not move toward the chairs positioned along the hallway wall. Neither did she. They stood in the corridor in a silence that was not comfortable, but was, Eleanor noted with some detachment, at least honest. She had spent the last 3 days surrounded by people who knew exactly what was happening and discussed it with the breezy confidence of the entirely unbothered. This silence was different. This silence had weight. It was the Duke who broke it. "Did you know?" he asked. The question was direct, almost blunt, stripped of the social cushioning that Boston's finest typically wrapped around anything that might cause discomfort. His voice was low even, and entirely without the careful gentleness that men usually deployed when they suspected a woman might cry. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Did I know what, specifically?" "What your family planned for this evening." He paused, then added with precision, "Whether you were surprised, or whether the surprise was a performance for the room." The question landed the way a cold glass of water lands. Sharp, clarifying, slightly unwelcome. Eleanor felt the familiar reflex rise in her, the impulse to deflect, to smooth, to produce one of the socially acceptable non-answers she had spent years perfecting. Oh, families are complicated. It was all arranged so quickly. You know how these charity events can be. She suppressed it. "I found out 3 days ago," she said. "My father had already signed the entry form." The conversation in which I learned of it lasted approximately 4 minutes and ended with my mother telling me to close my mouth and wear the blue dress. Silence. "I see," the Duke said. "Do you?" The words came out with slightly more edge than she intended. She softened them slightly, on the follow-through. "I only ask because most people, when they say 'I see,' mean something closer to 'I have filed this information,' and will now move on to the next topic." He looked at her for a moment, a long, measuring look that she held without flinching, because she had learned that flinching invited conclusions. "I meant it literally," he said. "I see the situation more clearly than I did 60 seconds ago." "And what do you see?" He was quiet for a beat. Then, "A young woman who was handed to a room full of people who found her humiliation entertaining, by a family that appears to have arranged the entire thing with the casualness of a dinner reservation." He paused. "And who is now standing in a corridor with a man she doesn't know, answering questions she has no particular reason to answer, with considerably more composure than the situation warrants." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. "You paid a great deal of money," she said finally. "For a charity auction you apparently found objectionable enough to end early." "I did." "Why?" It was his turn to be quiet. He looked away from her briefly, toward the portraits on the wall, the dark paneling, the candle nearest to them that was burning lower than the others. When he looked back, something in his expression had shifted, not opened exactly, but adjusted, as though he had made a small internal decision about how much to say. "Because I have seen that room before," he said. "Not this specific room, but that particular arrangement, a crowd enjoying something at one person's expense, and everyone present understanding it and saying nothing." He paused. "I find I have very little patience for it." Eleanor studied him. There was something in the way he had said it, not with heat, but with a kind of settled, long-standing certainty, that suggested the words came from somewhere specific. A memory, perhaps, or a history. She did not ask. Not yet. "So what happens now?" she said instead. "You've paid. The auction is concluded. I presume there is some social obligation attached. A dance, a supper, as my father described." "There is no obligation," the Duke said. "Not on your part." "The terms of the auction?" "The terms of the auction were set by people who had no right to set them." His voice was still even, but something underneath it had gone flat and final, like a door closing. "You did not agree to be auctioned. You were submitted without your consent. Whatever was promised on your behalf was promised without your knowledge." He met her eyes. "I paid to end the evening, Miss Voss, not to collect a prize." The word prize landed in the corridor between them and sat there. Eleanor felt something move through her that she could not immediately classify. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, not quite the simple, uncomplicated warmth that gratitude was supposed to feel like. It was more complex than that. More cautious. She had lived 20 years in a household where gestures of generosity tended to have clauses attached, and she had learned to read the fine print before she allowed herself to feel anything. "That is a generous position," she said carefully. "Most men in your situation would consider the terms binding. Most men in my situation engineered the situation to their advantage," he said. "I didn't engineer anything. I simply objected to what I was watching and acted accordingly." "And what do you want in return?" The question came out more plainly than she intended, more direct, more guarded. She saw him register it, the slight adjustment in his posture, the way his eyes moved over her face with something that might have been recognition. "Nothing," he said. "Tonight. Tonight." The word sat in the air with its implication intact, not a threat, not a promise, simply an honest acknowledgement that the evening was one thing and everything that came after it was another. Eleanor held his gaze. "You're very direct. You prefer it to the alternative," he said. "I suspect you've had rather too much of the alternative." She almost smiled. Almost. The reflex formed and then stopped itself, because she was not yet sure what kind of room this was, or what the rules were, or whether the man standing 3 feet away from her was precisely what he appeared to be or something more complicated. She had learned not to assume. "My family will be looking for me," she said. "Your family left 20 minutes ago," he said. "I saw their carriage from the window at the end of this corridor." Eleanor went very still. The information arranged itself in her mind with quiet, devastating clarity. Her father, her mother, her brother, departing in the family carriage while she was still inside, while she was still standing on a platform in a room full of laughing strangers, while the evening was still technically in progress. Gone. Without a word. Without a message sent through a servant. Without, apparently, any particular concern for how she would get home. "The work is done," she imagined her father thinking, settling back against the carriage seat with his particular expression of satisfied pragmatism. "The donation is made. The name is in the program. She can find her own way." She kept her face very still. "I see," she said, and was aware, distantly, that she was using the phrase he had used with precisely the meaning she had challenged him on. "I have filed this information and will now move on." He did not call attention to it. "My carriage is available," he said simply, "if you require it." Eleanor looked at him, at the steadiness of his expression, the absence of triumph or pity, or the particular brand of condescending kindness that men sometimes deployed when they wanted a woman to feel rescued and therefore indebted. There was none of that. There was only the offer, plain and without ornamentation, extended and waiting. She thought about what it would mean to accept it, the talk it would generate, the conclusions that would be drawn, the way her mother would receive the information tomorrow morning, with that particular smile that meant she was already calculating. Then she thought about standing in the entrance hall of the Hargrove mansion waiting for a carriage that was not coming, in a blue dress she had not chosen, at the end of an evening she had not agreed to attend. "Thank you," Eleanor said. It was the first time all evening she had said those words and meant them entirely. The Duke nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement, and turned toward the end of the corridor. This time she noticed he did slow his pace, just slightly, just enough. Eleanor Voss followed the Duke of Hargrove through the candlelit corridor of his family's mansion, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that of all the people who had been present in that ballroom tonight, 200 guests, her own blood among them, he was the only one who had looked at her and seen something worth stopping for. She tried not to think about it. She thought about it anyway. The invitation arrived on a silver tray. Eleanor recognized Lady Whitmore's stationery before Agnes had finished setting the tray on the writing desk, the heavy cream paper, the precise copperplate script, the small pressed flower in the upper corner that served as the Whitmore family's unofficial seal. She had received perhaps a dozen such invitations over the years, and had attended most of them, because in Boston's social landscape an invitation from Margaret Whitmore was less a request and more a summons with pleasant handwriting. "Dear Miss Voss," the note read, "a small gathering of friends for afternoon tea. Thursday, 3 o'clock. Your presence would be most welcome. Most welcome." Eleanor turned the phrase over in her mind. In Lady Whitmore's vocabulary, most welcome occupied a specific register, above appreciated, but below essential. It was the phrasing used for guests whose presence served a purpose beyond their own enjoyment. She went anyway. There were, she told herself, worse things than being useful to Margaret Whitmore. And refusing would generate its own set of conclusions, its own circulating narratives, its own version of events that Eleanor would have no opportunity to correct. She arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, in a dress of deep green wool that she had chosen specifically for its lack of theatricality. No lace, no empire waist, nothing that might invite comparison to a certain blue gown that had already achieved a level of social notoriety she found exhausting. Agnes had dressed her hair simply. She had worn her mother's pearl earrings because they were small and unremarkable, and suggested nothing. She was the 7th guest to arrive. The Whitmore drawing room was exactly what 40 years of careful accumulation could produce. Persian rugs, silk wallpaper in pale gold, furniture that managed to be simultaneously ornate and comfortable. 3 windows faced the garden. A fire burned low in the grate despite the mildness of the afternoon. On the central table, a tea service of such extravagance that it bordered on self-parody was already laid out. Tiered stands of small sandwiches and pastries, a silver teapot of considerable dimension, cups thin enough to be translucent. 10 women. Eleanor counted them as she entered, because she had learned early that the number of people in a room told you something about the nature of the gathering. Fewer than 6 suggested intimacy. More than 15 suggested performance. 10 was a deliberate number, large enough to constitute an audience, small enough that no one could claim they hadn't heard what was said. She knew most of them. Mrs. Aldrich, whose husband owned half the shipping on the eastern seaboard, and who wore her social opinions the way other women wore jewelry, prominently and at all times. Miss Fenwick, 22, and recently engaged, who had the particular brightness of someone who had recently secured her position and was enjoying the view from it. The Hartwell sisters, Caroline and Jane, who operated as a unit and specialized in the gentle, relentless extraction of information from people who didn't realize they were being questioned. Lady Whitmore herself stood near the fireplace in burgundy silk, with the expression of a woman who had organized something and was pleased with the arrangement. She greeted Eleanor with both hands extended, a warmth so practiced it had become genuine through sheer repetition. "My dear Eleanor," she said, "you look wonderfully composed." Wonderfully composed. The phrasing landed with precision. Eleanor smiled and said thank you and accepted a cup of tea and found a seat slightly to the left of center. Visible but not prominent, involved but not exposed. For the first 15 minutes the conversation was entirely ordinary. The weather. A new production at the theater. Mrs. Aldrich's opinions on the latest fashions from New York, delivered with the authority of someone who had never doubted that her opinions were the correct ones. Eleanor contributed a sentence here and there, drank her tea, and waited. It was Mrs. Aldrich who introduced the subject, which surprised Eleanor not at all. "I suppose," she said, setting down her cup with a small decisive click, "that we are all thinking about the same thing." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, some women smiling, some nodding, 1 or 2 exchanging glances with the particular complicity of people who had discussed this already and were now prepared to discuss it again, officially. Eleanor kept her expression pleasant and her hands still in her lap. "The Hargrove auction," Lady Whitmore said with the tone of someone naming a piece of theater they had found diverting. "Quite the event." "Quite," said Caroline Hartwell, and looked at Eleanor with eyes that were warm and entirely without mercy. "You must tell us, Eleanor. What was it like, being in the center of it all?" Being in the center of it all, as though she had chosen the position, as though the platform had been somewhere she had climbed voluntarily, for the pleasure of the view. It was a charity auction, Eleanor said. I imagine it was much like any other from the outside. Oh, but not from the inside, said Miss Fenwick, leaning forward slightly with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting to contribute. That must have been, I can't imagine, all those people watching. People watch at most social events, Eleanor said pleasantly. That is rather the point of them. A small laugh moved through the room, appreciative, slightly surprised. Eleanor noted it and filed it away. What I found remarkable, said Mrs. Aldrich, in the tone of someone about to say exactly what they found remarkable regardless of whether the subject had invited commentary, was the Duke's response. So very decisive, wouldn't you say? He bid, Eleanor said, at a charity auction. That is generally considered the expected behavior. He didn't bid, said Jane Hartwell, with the precision of someone correcting a minor factual error. He walked to the front of the room and ended the proceedings entirely. Without speaking to the auctioneer first, without consulting anyone. She paused. It was quite a statement. About the auction, presumably, Eleanor said. About you, some would say. Mrs. Aldrich replied. The room settled into a particular quality of silence, the kind that exists not in the absence of sound but in the collective holding of breath before something is said that everyone present has been building toward. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Aldrich steadily. I'm not certain a man paying a charity donation constitutes a statement about me personally. It does when he pays 4 times the suggested maximum, said Lady Whitmore gently, as though delivering this information were an act of kindness. And when he removes you from the room immediately afterward, and when his carriage is seen departing with you inside it. She smiled. People will draw conclusions, my dear. That is simply the nature of things. People drew conclusions before anything happened, Eleanor said. I find conclusions are generally prepared in advance and the events arranged around them afterward. Another small laugh, smaller this time. The question, said Caroline Hartwell, cutting through the pleasantries with the efficiency of a woman who had decided the circumlocution had gone on long enough, is what you intend to do about it. Your position is unusual. The Duke is not a man who acts impulsively. If he acted as he did, there was a reason. Or, said Miss Fenwick with the bright certainty of someone whose recent engagement had given her the confidence to say things she might otherwise have kept to herself, she positioned herself to be acted upon. I mean no offense, Eleanor. Truly. But one does wonder whether the entire situation was perhaps more arranged than it appeared. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Eleanor looked at Miss Fenwick. She kept her face entirely still and her voice entirely even and said, I wonder if you could clarify what you mean by arranged. Miss Fenwick had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Only that, well, you were entered into the auction, and the Duke responded as he did. And now there is a great deal of talk, which can only benefit. She stopped, redirected. I mean no criticism. Of course not, Eleanor said. You're simply suggesting that I orchestrated my own public humiliation as a romantic strategy. She paused. While standing on a platform in a room where no one, including my own family, raised any objection to my being there. Another pause. A remarkably sophisticated maneuver on my part. Dead silence. It was, Eleanor recognized distantly, the most she had said at once in a social setting in perhaps 2 years. She felt the slight internal tremor of having said too much, of having let the edge show, the thing she kept carefully blunted in rooms like this one. She breathed evenly and waited for the response. It was not the response she expected. From the chair nearest the window, the one Eleanor had assumed was unoccupied, positioned slightly apart from the main cluster of seats, a voice spoke. Well said. Eleanor turned. The woman was perhaps 30, dark-haired, simply dressed, with an ease of posture that suggested she had never once in her life been concerned about how she occupied a room. She had a cup of tea balanced on her knee, and an expression of calm, attentive interest that was entirely distinct from the careful social performances happening everywhere else in the drawing room. She looked at Eleanor with directness and something warmer than it. "Forgive me," she said, addressing the room with a small, pleasant smile. "I should introduce myself. I'm not sure Lady Whitmore mentioned I would be joining." She glanced at their hostess, who had gone very slightly still, Eleanor noticed, in a way that suggested this woman's presence was both known and complicated. "I'm Catherine Hargrove," the woman said, "James's sister." The drawing room went entirely silent. Eleanor looked at Catherine Hargrove, at the composed expression, the direct eyes, the particular quality of stillness that she recognized, she realized, because she had seen it 4 nights ago in a candle-lit corridor. The family resemblance was not in the features, but in the manner, that settled, unperformative certainty that required nothing from the room. "Miss Voss?" Catherine said, looking only at Eleanor now, as though the other 8 women had become furniture. "My brother asked me to find an opportunity to speak with you. He thought a direct approach might be less welcome, under the circumstances." A small, dry smile. He was perhaps right about that. He usually is, which is enormously irritating. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Around them, the drawing room had the quality of a stage between scenes. Everyone present and none of them moving. The entire social machinery of Boston's finest, temporarily suspended in the face of something it had not predicted. "He sent you," Eleanor said carefully. "He suggested I might attend this particular gathering," Catherine replied. "The suggestion and the sending are not quite the same thing. I make my own decisions." She tilted her head slightly. "As I suspect, do you, when you're permitted to." Eleanor felt something move through her again. That careful, complicated thing that was not quite relief and not quite hope and not quite anything she had a clean word for. She looked at Catherine Hargrove and understood, with sudden clarity, that the afternoon had not gone the way Lady Whitmore had arranged it to go, and that whatever came next was going to be entirely different from what any of them had expected, including perhaps herself. The Whitmore front door had barely closed behind them before Catherine spoke. "My carriage is at the corner," she said, already moving down the front steps with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had decided what happened next and saw no reason to delay it. "I'd like to drive for a while if you're willing. There are things I want to tell you before you speak to James, and a moving carriage is, in my experience, the best place for conversations that require privacy." Eleanor followed her without hesitation, which surprised her slightly as she descended the steps into the pale afternoon light. She was not, as a rule, a person who followed strangers into carriages. But Catherine Hargrove was not quite a stranger, and something in the quality of her directness, its lack of agenda, its absence of performance, had produced in Eleanor a response she rarely felt in social situations: simple trust. The carriage was dark blue, understated, with no family crest on the door. Inside, it smelled of leather and something faintly botanical, a sachet of dried lavender tucked somewhere Eleanor couldn't see. Catherine settled across from her with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in small spaces, and the carriage moved into the street, and Boston's afternoon traffic closed around them, and for a moment neither woman spoke. Then Catherine said, "James was 15 when it happened." Eleanor looked at her. "I want to start there," Catherine said, "because everything else makes more sense if you understand where it began." She held Eleanor's gaze steadily. "Our father, the previous Duke, had a ward, a young woman named Isabel Price. She had come to us at 17, after her own father's death, left her with no male relatives and no income. She was—" Catherine paused, choosing the word with care. "Remarkable, intelligent, warm in a way that made rooms feel different when she was in them." She looked out the carriage window briefly, then back. "Our father decided, when Isabel was 19, that she had become a social liability. She had no dowry, no family connections, and she had complicated things, I think, by being exactly herself, rather than the quiet, grateful dependent he had expected. So he arranged an event, a charity gathering, here in Boston. And at that gathering, he presented Isabel as available for courtship. Publicly, without her knowledge, in front of 200 people who found the entire spectacle enormously entertaining. Eleanor felt something go very quiet inside her. James was in the room, Catherine continued. He was 15 and he had no power, and he stood there and watched it happen and did nothing, because there was nothing a 15-year-old boy could do against his father's decision in a room full of adults who were laughing. She paused. Isabel was married off within 6 weeks to a man twice her age who treated her with the particular cruelty of someone who had purchased something and felt entitled to use it carelessly. She died 4 years later. Childbed fever. Another pause. James was 19 by then. He had not forgotten. The carriage moved through a quieter street, the sound of hooves on cobblestone filling the silence between them. He never spoke of it publicly, Catherine said. Not once. Not to me, not to anyone, as far as I know. He simply carried it, the way some people carry things that have no resolution. The way you carry something when you were present for it and did nothing and have spent 16 years knowing you did nothing. She looked at Eleanor directly. When he saw you on that platform, he didn't see a stranger. He saw Isabel. He saw the room he stood in at 15. And this time he was not 15, and there was something he could do. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. Outside, a street vendor called something unintelligible. A child laughed somewhere past the carriage window. Boston continued its ordinary afternoon entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being said inside a dark blue carriage moving through its streets. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. Not with suspicion, simply with the genuine need to understand the shape of what was happening. "Because James won't," Catherine said simply. "Not easily, not first. He is." She made a small gesture with one hand, searching for the phrase. "He is a man who acts and then stands very still and waits to see what the action produced, because explaining himself feels to him like diminishing the thing he did. He would rather you thought him impulsive or eccentric or simply very wealthy, and therefore accustomed to getting what he wants." She paused. "None of those things are true, and you deserve to know what is." "And what does he want?" Eleanor asked. "Now, not 16 years ago, now." Catherine looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "He wants," she said carefully, "to know if you are all right. That is genuinely the first thing. Everything else is secondary to that, and I say that as someone who has watched my brother navigate social situations for 31 years and has never once seen him prioritize anything above the management of appearances until 4 nights ago." She folded her hands in her lap. "What happened at the Whitmore gathering today will be in circulation by this evening. James anticipated something like it. That is why he asked me to be there." Her expression shifted slightly, something more direct coming through. "He could not go himself without producing exactly the kind of public narrative that would make your situation worse. So he sent the next best thing. His sister. His sister, who is considerably more frightening in drawing rooms than he is, and who has fewer reservations about saying what she thinks." Catherine tilted her head. "Though I notice you managed that rather well yourself. The thing you said to Miss Fenwick about orchestrating your own humiliation as a romantic strategy. That was very good." "I said too much," Eleanor said. "You said exactly enough," Catherine replied. "There's a difference, and it matters." She studied Eleanor for a moment. "He would like to speak with you, James. Today, if possible. This evening, at the house. I'll accompany you, if that makes it more proper, or wait in another room, whichever you prefer." She paused. "He asked me to make clear that the choice is entirely yours. He is not your father, Miss Voss. He does not arrange things on your behalf and present them to you as conclusions." Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. 16 years. A girl named Isabel Price, presented to a laughing room by a man with a title and the casual confidence of someone who had never once considered that his ward was a person rather than a problem. A 15-year-old boy, standing at the edge of the room, powerless and silent, carrying the weight of that silence for the next decade and a half. She thought about what it meant, to act not from desire or strategy or the calculation of social advantage, but from something older and more private. A debt paid not to her but to a ghost. An intervention that had nothing to do with her, except that it had changed everything about her situation. She thought about how she felt about that. The answer, she found, was complicated. "This evening," she said. The Hargrove residence was quieter at 7 o'clock than it had been on the night of the gala. The chandeliers reduced to a fraction of their capacity, the grand rooms visible through interior doorways dim and still. The entire house returned to the scale of a place people actually lived in, rather than a venue for spectacle. A butler admitted Eleanor and Catherine with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been doing this for decades, and led them through a corridor she recognized, the same candlelit hallway, the same portraits on the dark paneling, to a door at the far end that she had not noticed 4 nights ago. The library. Catherine touched her arm briefly before the butler opened the door. "I'll be in the sitting room at the end of the hall," she said quietly. "Take as long as you need." Eleanor nodded once. The door opened. James Hargrove was standing at the window, the one that faced the garden, she would later learn, though in the evening darkness there was nothing to see through it. He was in a simpler coat than the one he had worn the night of the gala, and his cravat was less formally tied, and he was holding a book he was clearly not reading. And when he turned at the sound of the door, he had the expression of a man who had been waiting and was relieved that the waiting was over, though he would not have said so. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your sister told me about Isabel Price," Eleanor said. She watched the impact of this move through him, a slight stillness, a very brief recalibration, the book lowering a fraction in his hand. Not shock, exactly. More like the particular quality of being known in a way one had not prepared for. "She told me you would say that," he said finally. "Is it true?" "Yes." One word. No elaboration, no deflection, no performance of calm. Simply yes, clean and complete, and asking nothing in return. Eleanor moved further into the room. The library was large and warm, lit by a fire and several lamps, its shelves floor to ceiling and dense with books that looked read rather than displayed. She stopped near the central table, not close to him, not far, a distance that felt honest. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what it means. That your reason for acting was personal, historical. That I was not, in the relevant sense, the point. You were the point," he said quietly. "Isabel is why I recognized it. You are why I moved." She looked at him. "I need to be clear," he continued, with the careful precision of a man who had been composing this sentence for 4 days. "Because I have no interest in you misunderstanding my intentions. I did not act on your behalf because I expected something in return. I did not send Catherine to the Whitmore gathering as a maneuver. I am not—" He stopped, started again. "I have spent most of my adult life being managed around and maneuvered toward by people who wanted things from my family's name or my family's money. I have no appetite for doing the same to someone else." "Then what do you want?" Eleanor asked, for the second time that day. The same question, asked now of a different person, in a quieter room, with considerably more riding on the answer. James Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. "To know if you are all right," he said, genuinely. "Not as a social nicety. Boston is a very efficient machine for making people feel small, and your family has given it considerable material to work with, and I would like to know—" He paused. "I would like to know if Eleanor Voss, specifically, is standing up under the weight of it." Eleanor felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been carrying so constantly that she had stopped registering it as tension and had simply incorporated it into the basic structure of how she existed. It released now, quietly, like a knot coming undone. She was quiet for a moment. "I am," she said, "standing up under it." She paused, with, it turns out, some unexpected assistance. Something shifted in his face, small, precise. Not quite a smile, but its honest precursor. "Your family will not stop," he said. "Whatever they are planning, they will not stop. You understand that. I've always understood that, she said. I simply didn't, until recently, have any alternative to managing them alone. The word alone sat between them without drama, without performance, stating simply what it meant. You don't have to do that anymore, James said. Not a promise? Not yet. A fact, offered plainly, without ornament, the way he seemed to offer most things. If you don't want to. Eleanor Voss stood in the library of the Hargrove residence in the quiet evening, 4 days after a room full of Boston's finest society had laughed at her from a charitable distance and considered the extraordinary, improbable, entirely unlooked-for fact that the most honest conversation she had ever had in her life was happening now. With a man she had first seen 40 minutes before, he changed everything. I don't want to, she said. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she meant something completely, without reservation, without the fine print. The fire burned low in the grate. Outside, Boston continued its evening. And in the Hargrove library, two people who had both learned the cost of silence began, very carefully, to speak.